President of the General Assembly, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, guests, diplomats, we are here to remember slavery today and to celebrate the heritage, culture, and roots of the African diaspora. Most people do not want to remember slavery, some from feelings of guilt, others from feelings of shame. Most African diasporans do not want to remember slavery when we think about the brutal treatment that our ancestors were subjected to. We prefer to forget slavery. To associate remembering slavery with celebrating seems very contradictory, unless we remember slavery differently, unless we tell the story of the African diaspora in a way that indeed merits celebrating. Current research makes such retelling not only possible, but even obligatory if it is our intention to tell the truth about the Americas and about the global African diaspora. Telling this story in new ways also fits with the mission of the Remember Slavery program that has as its mandate to educate people about the causes, consequences, and lessons of the slave trade and slavery, and to raise awareness about the dangers of racism and prejudice. Telling the story in new ways also fits with the first theme, recognition, of the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. Recognition is a necessary foundation for the other two themes of justice and development. The program of activities for the implementation of the decade states that these activities should lead to greater knowledge, recognition, and respect for the history, heritage, and culture of people of African descent through research and education. Promote full and accurate inclusion of their history and contributions in educational curricula, and raise awareness by providing information. Questions that immediately come to mind listening to these ideas about these activities are, what do we know and what do we not know about the history, heritage, and culture of people of African descent? What are the implications of knowing and of not knowing for people of African descent and for others? What do we need to know and what do we need to do in order to create respect for this history, heritage, and culture? Today's International Day of Remembrance, commemorating victims of slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, should remind us of the foundational role that the enslavement of Africans in the Americas played in the creation of the modern world. It is also important, especially for the United Nations, to situate this Atlantic presence of people of African descent within the global African diaspora that reveals broader dimensions and implications. We should know, for example, the demographics of the Americas. Of the 6.5 million people who crossed the Atlantic Ocean between 1500 and 1800, only 1 million came from Europe. 5,500,000 people came from Africa. So, that means that during 300 of the 500-year history of the Americas, the overwhelming majority of the population of the Americas was of African origin. That is something that we need to know, and I suspect that most of us do not know it. The unremunerated labor of these enslaved Africans and their descendants enriched Europe and developed the Americas. Between 1650 and 1850, these Africans produced 75% of the commodities traded in the Atlantic world, fueling the Industrial Revolution that created today's economic system in which we all live. So it is impossible to tell the story of the Americas without considering the roles and contributions of the majority of the population that laid its foundations. When industrialization replaced slavery in the 1800s, people of African descent received no compensation for centuries of unpaid work. In the British, French, and Spanish empires, in Brazil, and in Washington, D.C., enslavers, however, were rewarded by their governments with generous compensation from the loss of the income that they would no longer derive from the free labor of their former human property. So the same people who for hundreds of years were enriched by the enslavement of people of African descent were further enriched by their emancipation. Now, it is generally assumed that the Africans who were enslaved just as unskilled laborers. Such a perspective makes absolutely no sense, given that Africans were brought across the Atlantic to create new societies in natural environments that were more familiar to them than they were to their enslavers. Some Africans were enslaved precisely because of their skills and their knowledge, and they provided a transfer of technology from Africa to the Americas. People from what was called the Gold Coast, now Ghana, whom the Portuguese and Spanish called negros minas, mine Negroes, were selected for their expertise in gold mining and metallurgy. In Ecuador and Colombia, descendants of negros minas still pan gold and transform it into beautiful creations. African knowledge also helped to feed the Americas. In Brazil, Jamaica, Suriname, and the United States, enslaved Africans planted rice that had been domesticated 3,500 years ago in Mali, not in Asia. This was Oryza glaberrima, that is an African rice. U.S. plantation owners asked slave ship captains to bring them rice Negroes, known for their expertise in the complex cultivation and preparation techniques. South Carolina became North America's richest plantation economy, thanks to this African rice. In addition to bringing systems of knowledge with them to the Americas, Africans maintained and recreated their cultures. Almost half of the Africans came from Angola, the Congos, and Gabon, the Central African region over which the powerful Congo Kingdom reigned for centuries. And in the Americas today, in their festivities, Brazil's congadas and Panama's congos perpetuate memories of royal traditions from the Congo Kingdom. I had hoped to be able to show you images of these celebrations and of these continuities, but apparently that's not done in this kind of environment. So I hope that there will be another occasion on which I can show you what I'm telling you about. Descendants of Yoruba people from Nigeria and Benin in West Africa were concentrated in Brazil and Cuba. As a result, in Brazil and Cuba, the spiritual beings of the Yoruba continue to be feted, and these spiritual beings represent forces of nature. And so in their celebrations, they dance, they drum, they sing, as the forces of nature visit their human children. Today, there are about 200 million people of African descent living in all of the nations of the America, with no exceptions, from Chile to Canada, including in unexpected places. Here I would have shown you Afro-Bolivians, Afro-Argentinians. Maybe you have not seen them. My favorite Bolivian's name is Juan Angola Maconde. So there is African culture every place in the Americas. And the historical contributions of these Africans and the living traditions trace an African map of the Americas. Beyond the Atlantic world, people of African origin also live across the Mediterranean Sea in Turkey, where descendants of Africans enslaved during the Ottoman Empire affirm their identity as Afro-Turks, and in May will celebrate again their calf feast, which I attended a couple of years ago. Africans also traveled across the Indian Ocean, voluntarily as well as involuntarily. And India has several totally distinct populations of African origin from different parts of Africa, living in different parts of India, speaking different languages, writing in different ways. And I don't need to tell you everything about them, because if you go to the hall, you will see the tradition of elite Afro-Indians and Afro-Indian rulers. So, unlike the Americas, where there was no workforce and Africans became the workforce, India didn't need such a workforce. And so you will see, for example, Malik Ambar, who rose from an enslaved Ethiopian from Harar district and became a general and became the ruler of Ahmednagar on toward the Indian Ocean coast of India. Afro-Indians also built monuments. You will see an image of the Siddhi Said Mosque in Gujarat. You will see Janjira Island, from which Afro-Indians ruled a princely state and controlled maritime traffic on the Konkani coast. There are also Africans who went to India voluntarily. One was Bavagor, who was an agate merchant. He transformed the technology of agate production, and he also had spiritual powers allowing him to defeat a demoness, and so a shrine was built in his honor at which now not only Siddhis, but many non-Siddhis also worship this African saint. And for this African saint, Siddhis play instruments that are of African origin, including the malunga, that is exactly the same as the berimbau in Brazil, so that this map, this African map, transcends the Americas and links culture of African diasporan communities across various oceans and continents. A colleague and I made a documentary called Slave Roots, A Global Vision. We made it for the UNESCO Slave Root Project. It's been shown here, but several years ago. And I showed it to a group of adolescents, African descendant adolescents in Brooklyn. And they had very interesting comments that went to the root of the problem that is raised in telling new stories, creating new narratives about slavery in the African diaspora. One student asked, why haven't we been told the whole story about African people, like that we're not just here in the United States, but are all over the world, not only throughout the Americas, but even in places we'd never think about, like India, where Africans were even rulers. Why don't they teach us in school the kinds of things you showed us in this film? The next student said, why haven't we learned that some Africans were enslaved for how smart they were? Why were we taught that they were all dumb and did mindless work on plantations and got whipped by people who owned them? Who wants that as the only image of our ancestors? A third said, yeah, why doesn't school teach us stuff that would make us proud of our ancestors and make other people respect us? They only want us to learn stuff that makes us ashamed to be descendants of enslaved people. It's like they're hiding the good part of the truth. Whereas the program of activities for the decade recommends ensuring that textbooks and other educational materials reflect historical facts accurately as they relate to past tragedies and atrocities, the Brooklyn teenagers insisted that there was already too much focus on tragedies and atrocities, on victimization. So, it is indeed necessary to educate people about the horrors of the slave trade and slavery, because their consequences continue to determine and explain today's prejudiced attitudes and racist behaviors. I'm sure you can think of many of those. For educational materials to reflect historical facts accurately, they must also highlight the accomplishments and contributions of people of African descent, in spite of the tragedies and atrocities. The Brooklyn students and their peers elsewhere in the diaspora with whom I've spoken want their schools to teach them more complete, truthful, and empowering knowledge that will give them a sense of global citizenship, and they also want their education to offer them an honest narrative that will allow them to feel good about themselves and their heritage and inspire the esteem of others. Raising awareness and creating respect for the history, heritage, and culture of people of African descent by generating new research-based narratives and institutionalizing them in educational curricula is a stated goal for the Remember Slavery program and for the UN decade. Some of us are already deeply involved in shaping and sharing such new narratives and are seeking committed and conscientious collaboration to further the process. I invite you to collaborate in remembering that in spite of the slave trade and slavery, people of African descent in the global diaspora have made major contributions to world civilization that merit celebrating because they have enriched us all.